listener. You are listening to the inaugural episode of Totes Rad, a podcast where we read, discuss, and dissect banned books. I am one of your three hosts, DaPurpleSharpie, and I'm joined by Gemma as well as Jazz. A little bit about me. I happen to be a somewhat well-known figure inside of the fighting game community, specifically because of my work promoting Skullgirls ad nauseum. In addition, I'm also relatively well-known inside of the gaming sphere, specifically the indie gaming sphere, because I host an event called Game Devs of Color Expo. I'll allow Gemma to tell you a little bit more about herself.
Well, hello, everybody. My name is Gemma, and I am also one of your hosts of Totes Rad. I am something of a musician myself, a composer. I also love reading and love learning and dissecting and discovering more about our history, about the world. Jazz?
Hey y'all, I'm Jazz. I am a narrative designer and writer based in California. You can find me at Jazz Pomegranate on Blue Sky. I'm also a vocal Black woman on the internet.
Podcast with three Black women. Love this for us. The very first book that we will be dissecting on this podcast is White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide by Carol Anderson. Carol Anderson was originally requested to write a piece back in August of 2014. After writing that op-ed inside of the Washington Post, the flames of white rage consumed the comments of that article, and she was compelled to write this book, which we will be beginning by dissecting the prelude. So I want to go ahead and open up the floor, starting with you here, Jazz. What were your thoughts overall of this really interesting opening prelude that we kind of had to this book?
For me, I think the thing that sort of really stuck with me coming out of this talk about Rudy Giuliani and sort of bringing it back to Amadou Diallo, who was likewise well, in the case of Diallo, murdered by the police rather than a vigilante. Something that really stuck with me was the insistence by Giuliani that the NYPD was acting incredibly professionally when it emptied 40 rounds into this man?
Yeah, 41.
41 bullets.
And it's just like, as crazy as that sounds, like as a statement to just say, we were acting so professionally, we try to mitigate damage and stuff like that. It's unfortunately still something that you see, like, to this day, where a lot of institutions and countries will say that they are acting in a very professional and restrained manner, and the sort of colonial subjects that they are doling out this incredibly just unmatched levels of violence onto are the real problem.
It's really interesting as well, because so much of the language that we see inside of the prologue regarding Rudy Giuliani and his statements there, which I want to just note for the listener, this book was written and published in 2016 on the eve of the very first Trump presidency, right? And you see so much of the verbiage that Rudy Giuliani uses here being espouted now currently inside of common day Republican conversations about Black people overwhelmingly, also about Hispanic communities in addition. I thought that also really sat with me, but I think the thing that sat with me the most, I'm actually just going to read a straight up quote here, was the statement of white rage is not about visible violence, but rather it works its way through the courts, the legislators, and a range of government bureaucracies. The trigger for white rage inevitably is Black advancement. And that to me kind of encapsulated the entirety of this book. The entirety of what white rage really is, for me, was encapsulated inside of those two sentences, because any time when I've seen not necessarily that passive aggressive racism that you see flavored inside of these statements, you're not quite this or that, or you guys should be policing your own communities, you all should be doing this, and which is just, okay, you know what, maybe passive aggressive racism isn't the right word, maybe just straight up racism, you know?
It is straight up racism. And I think one of the interesting points that we see mirrored is not that it's white rage, but it's also white rage maintaining this high ground morally that doesn't necessarily exist, you know? Carol Anderson, she cites the fact that we have this perpetuated ideal of, oh, well, Black poverty, they don't value education, they don't value hard work, they don't value ambition. They, you have the myth of the absentee Black father that's still perpetuated to this day, which we've disproven these myths. And at this point, you have these people who are saying these things over and over again because they refuse to see Black people advancing as a positive thing. It's got to be negative in their eyes.
I have a question, which I'd like to pose to all the Black women as I have the conversation here, which is all three of us, right?
Yeah.
So much of the United States history is founded upon the removal of power of Black America. And inside of this book, overwhelmingly, inside of the prologue, I think that we see Dr. Anderson do something that Black women are very frequently required to do prior to starting a conversation, which is state why they are allowed to have that conversation. Inside of the prologue, we see her say, the reason why I am allowed to have this conversation about what happened with Michael Brown and Ferguson, Missouri, is because I lived inside of Missouri. I saw what Brown versus Board of Education does. She doesn't talk about her very, very, very long history of African American studies. She doesn't write about all of the books and studies that she does. She says, I've lived here and I have seen the state and the way that these districts roll things out. So my question to the both of you is, what does it say about this woman who literally has a doctorate inside of the studies of African American history inside of the United States? The fact that she has to make the claim of, well, I lived here, and that is my resume. I'll start with you here, Gemma.
There's a saying that I've heard is that a lot of Black women, or Black people in general, but specifically Black women, are required to be beyond overqualified for anything that they have to do. Case in point, there was a job that I was going for, and this is a job well below my pay grade, well in a level that I have done previously before. I have done well in that job previously, yet I still had to A, reapply, and B, I didn't even get the job. After saying, well, this is my resume, this is what I've done in the years since I have left this job after being promoted from this position. Now I'm going back to step back into an old role because I need something to do. Wanted to go back somewhere that felt a little comfortable. No, I was not qualified enough, apparently.
Jazz, what are your thoughts?
So I think it's actually kind of interesting that she issues the sort of more official resume to talk about like her, I guess, street level understanding as like a resident and a local. I think that to be honest, I wonder if people, especially people who are predisposed to want to disagree with the claims that she's making, might point to, the fact that she has, a PhD and has done all of these years of research in African American studies. Like, I think that there is definitely a tendency, especially nowadays, but I think it was also still present when she was writing in 2016, where there's this kind of like anti-intellectualism, where basically the university is woke and hates white people. So if she touts that she's from a university writing this book about how violent, white supremacy has been towards Black people historically, then, well, suddenly it's not because necessarily any of this is real, but because she, as a, quote unquote, woke academic, doing all of this stuff to sully the good name of America, is making these arguments. So I wonder if part of the reason why she went for the more personal sort of like connection there was to kind of fend off those sorts of accusations.
I think that's actually a really good viewpoint. And to kind of tack onto that, I definitely agree. Like we're seeing it overwhelmingly now that we're almost a month out from the 2024 election, right? Kind of like a major FU to anyone who was blue and college educated, and that's not what we want in this country. That's not what we stand for. We are the working people type of vibe being resonate, right? And Jazz, I know, similar to myself, you are incredibly online on Blue Sky. And as users who happen to have a very large audience and happen to use our very large platform to speak out about overwhelmingly Black issues, I'm sure you've seen quite a few trolls appear on your account that have consistently used verbiage to attack intellectual points that we may make. So I'm really happy that you brought it up, because that is very possibly something that Dr. Anderson was attempting to do here. Let's move it over to the final paragraphs that we have here of the prologue, where we start getting a little bit of alliteration illumination, I'd like to call it. Dr. Anderson starts preaching, all right? She starts going into what the truth is. And she goes into the historic aspects of what Black people, African Americans inside the United States, have had to endure, have had to move past and excel at, all to be knocked down yet again by white rage. And her final statement ends from this alliteration illumination here with, the truth is, white rage has undermined democracy, warped the Constitution, weakened the nation's ability to compete economically, squandered billions of dollars on baseless incarceration, rendered an entire region sick, poor, and woefully uneducated, and left cities nothing less than decimated. When I finished this prologue, it left me ready and hungry for more. But I'm very curious, and I'd actually like to start with you here, Jazz. After reading the entirety of this prologue, what were your thoughts on what the remainder of this book was going to do? And what were your thoughts on who this book was for?
That's a really good question, because reading through the prologue and reading through, not necessarily trying to talk about what's further on, but having read further in, I definitely gather that a lot of this is information that generally I think a lot of Black people culturally know. I think that we receive stories in our families about those times back then when, the lighter skinned people in our family got to go to a different school than the darker skinned people in our family, or got to even maybe live in a different part of town. We have stories about, my grandmother took a shortcut coming home from school one day, stumbled upon a guy who was lynched, never took a shortcut again. Jesus. Things like that. There is a sort of milieu that we grow up in as like Black people in America that I think we kind of generally understand a lot of this stuff. So even though I definitely learned things reading this book and was able to, hear about perhaps specific like anecdotes and specific stories and specific historical instances of these things occurring. I think that generally, though, especially with the amount of statistics and stuff that she ends up listing throughout the book, it does feel like it's kind of a hand holding, like we gotta really walk white people through like step by step from the very end of the Civil War, how this thing was kind of doomed to start.
I think the important part about that is, yes, this is a book that is designed around hand-holding a certain demographic and saying, you might not understand this, but this is what the truth of the situation is. How often in educational programs do we have Black history listed as a footnote? Oh, yeah, well, emancipation happened and then all the slaves were free, the end, happily ever after. When in reality, every single Black family has had the talk of, hey, you are Black in America. There are certain things you can do. There are certain things you cannot do. I mean, listen, I was stupid when I was a kid. I got the talk multiple times on multiple times. And there is a demographic, there's a white demographic of this country, generally has not had that conversation with the same contact, with the same weight. Back when my uncle bought a house, he within the first week, I think, of him moving in, he tells a story about how he looked into the woods across the street from him one day, and he saw a noose. This was after Obama was elected. Like there is, and I love the ways you put it, Jazz. There is certain things that we as Black people in this country have learned to understand our realities of our condition, of just existing in a air quotes white space.
Yeah.
That people do not understand fully. And I honestly, my reaction to this book was just homegirls preaching. So
yeah. No, I think I'm actually unfortunately gonna have to disagree with both of you all, because it sounds like both of you agree that the demographic this book was meant for is overwhelmingly a white audience, right? I actually don't think that was Dr. Anderson's intention. To me, it almost feels more like this book is a way of documenting and explaining to other Black people, similar to myself, like suburban Black kids, hey, by the way, racism isn't just white people mad at Black people. And I know you've lived through that and I know you know it, but these statements are just as racist as the Klan coming out and lynching someone. Without obviously giving anything away about future chapters, I do want to just note here, the name of the prologue is Kindling, which is powerful in and of itself to me specifically, because there are so many moments throughout this prologue where I'm reading it, and especially at the end, which, once again, I'm just going to say it because I feel like so proud of myself for calling it this, but the illumination section, where she describes factually different truth sections of African Americans' histories that have led up to this point where white rage has always been a component towards the destruction and the decimation of the African American community inside the United States of America. There are so many points where it feels like this is her not like us moment. This is her euphoria. This is her euphoria. This is her putting out the warning shot saying, hey, if you can't stand with this, you're not gonna like the rest of what I have inside of this book, high key. And to me, this is once again just me looking at it through my lens. I don't see a white person picking up a book called White Rage. I don't see that happening.
I mean, the only time I can see it happening is if it's required reading in a college, to be quite honest.
Which,
But
to be
in a
very
woke college
honest,
that
it
hates
will not
America.
be.
Yeah.
Yeah, the reason why this book is the very first book we're dissecting inside of our podcast is because I found out about this book because I was watching, and I may be misquoted here, but I was watching a congressional investigation about radical race theory, and this book was brought up. That's how I found out about it. So this book isn't necessarily banned. This book is just inside of conversations of this is what is being taught inside of school to make white people hate themselves. That was the conversation around the book, as I recall. Now, to be very honest, I may be misremembering it. This was a very long time ago. This was around 3-4 years ago. And in total truth and total honesty, I was going through some stuff at that time. It's kind of hazy. but what I do know is that the name of the book stuck with me so much that I didn't actually Google it. I literally went over to my local library and checked to see if they had the name of the book there. And I couldn't find it, and I was peeved, you know? So I actually ordered it off of my Amazon Kindle, and I started reading it. But I think there is something to be said about the fact that stories about racism, even though they are passed down inside the Black community, affect different members of the Black community differently, right? There's so many different socioeconomic statuses that Black people currently occupy inside of America. But to white people, Black people are one person, the monolith, right?
It's actually funny you brought that up because, ooh, hold on a second.
No, preach.
I'm about to start preaching. No, it's funny you brought that up because in my history, I've gone to a couple different Christian evangelical church camps. Some of them were in the South, some of them were in the North. And some of the ones in the South very much had this pervasive idea that it does not matter where the Black person comes from. There is very much the existence of, oh, well, you're Black Christians, you don't do Christianity the same way, even though I'm one of the speakers at their camp, you know? And so I feel embarrassed to say this, but I've never really heard all Black people are not a monolith and thought, well, of course they're not a monolith, you know? I've always heard that saying without thinking of the context to white people. Because in reality, yeah, to white people, Black people are a monolith, even though we may not be.
Oh, absolutely.
There are a lot of moments where I think about opportunities as they extend to my husband, who's light-skinned, right? He looks more Hispanic than African American, but he's not. He's African American and Caucasian. And the thing that I always think about is like when someone sees him, there are several preconceived notions, and everything about Blackness is not necessarily projected onto him, right? But the minute I come into play, because I'm a dark-skinned Black woman, that's the very first thing on their minds, right? And now our relationship is thrown into question when they see both of us together, type of deal. Because now it's like, oh, this is interracial. You know what I mean? It's not, these are two Black people together because they look totally different. No, I'm serious. Okay. But it is interesting because my group of friends don't act like that, you know? So I don't have to deal with that in my day-to-day because that's not the people that I surround myself with. But it is an issue if I then go to his workplace or if I went to my workplace and they're meeting him for the very first time. because they're not expecting my husband to look like this. Or when I go to his workplace, they're not expecting me to look like that. There's a certain level of, as soon as they see my skin, suddenly every single story that he's told about me is completely, it just goes out of the window. You know, like I know everything about her personality. Oh, but she's black.
And
you know?
suddenly, that changes everything. Oof.
My husband will be like, yeah, you know, she's a really big gamer. She's a nerd, X, Y, and Z. And then I come in there and they're like so surprised because they did not picture a black woman, a dark-skinned black woman. That was not what they had in mind when he said, yeah, she does stuff with, she's a gamer girl, you know? But Jazz, I'll allow you to continue. Sorry.
No, yeah, I wanted to circle back to the question of audience, and also the notion that like black people like aren't a monolith, and this notion of like cultural communication, because I definitely want to like affirm what you were saying about sort of like, you know, the contexts in which we receive all of these stories is not always the same. I know that as a black person who grew up in California, like a pretty light-skinned black person who was like constantly told, like basically like my hair is like the main thing. If I had straighter hair, I could like probably pass as something else. But you know, I was constantly told when I was like growing up, like, oh, like you're like white on the inside and stuff like that. But no, yeah, that's a whole can of worms
Girl
that like we don't even need to like really like unpack right now. But this you know, growing up, you know, light skinned in California, rather affluent, like those factors, the context in which I initially received stories of the old days and received stories of segregation, which my parents grew up in. Both my parents were born in 1956. My mom was grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. My dad grew up in the lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans, Louisiana. Like these people knew where they came from. But also, when we received these stories, it was always in like the lens of like, look where we've come from, right? We are here now in the promised land, but you know, back there, and we would go, you know, we would still, you know, go back down south to like visit family and stuff, but there was a pretty strong understanding, like in my immediate family, that like we are not going back, right? Like we are people who are like moving forward, moving northward, and moving towards freedom. And there is a sort of you know, I think that what this book does help do, I think, is contextualize a lot of those stories about, you know, we're moving northward, we're moving away. I think it's easy for those stories to over time have become warped into we're moving away from those other right? Oh, I'm sorry, I can't say that on with the cursing, but
I will bleep that out.
Okay,
I will bleep
thank
that out.
you.
But essentially the thought process of moving away from N-words is very consistently contextualized in historical context of Black migration, which is then contextualized as white flight, which I think are both terms that anyone who's listening to this podcast is familiar with, right? I'm really happy, Jazz, that you brought it back to that, because that one statement I said earlier, the trigger for white rage, inevitably, is Black advancement. The very next sentence continues, it is not the mere presence of Black people that is the problem. Rather, it is Blackness with ambition, with drive, with purpose, with aspirations, and with demands for full and equal citizenship, which was so aptly put together inside of your statement and your sharing of history there. So I thank you for sharing that story. We're coming close to time here, so I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up this episode with a final question, which is, I know everyone here has already read past the next couple of chapters that we're going to go over, but based upon this prologue, is there something that you would like to see later inside of this book that maybe the prologue briefly touched on that really like spoke to you? You were excited, like almost foaming at the mouth to see. Gemma, I'll start with you here.
Yeah. One of the most interesting things that was mentioned was as a part of what did you call it? The alliteration imagination?
Alliteration illumination.
Alliteration
yes, ma'am.
illumination. Thank you. As a former educator, when Brown versus Board of Education was brought up, I was really intrigued to see, okay, what is the framework leading up into Brown versus Board of Education? Because I think on a surface level, I understand that Brown versus Board overturned the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. But surely it wasn't just that. What else led up to that? What are the court cases, the context, the landscape politically that allowed for such a decision as Brown versus Board? I know dang well it was not just a random court case popping up.
Mm-hmm.
Things like that have to be planned and prepared for meticulously.
Mm-hmm. Jazz, let's go to you.
Well, if any of our listeners follow me on Blue Sky, you all know that I am a huge fan of 19th century racism, which I firmly believe was a adventure. And so I am very excited to dig into, in our next episode, the late 19th century and some of the wacky ideas that some people had. A certain great emancipator president of ours had about what we should do with all the slaves after we free them. So
yes,
yeah,
yes, a lot of good stuff to dissect there. To be honest, I'm gonna go ahead and fully wrap it up by saying the thing I'm actually looking forward to the most inside of here, and I'm sure it's similar to anybody who purchased this book immediately after Trump's first presidency, is Dr. Anderson starts off this book by quoting then New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani, who moved on to become a literal felon, a convicted felon as well, as alongside President Trump. And I'm really, really interested in seeing how Dr. Anderson dissects his conversations and his speech that she mentioned inside of this prologue, and kind of delves more into where this thought process came from originally. I want to know more about the very first time people started blaming Black people for not doing better for themselves. I want to know exactly when that started, because that's not something I've ever been able to really put my finger on. Is this is the very first time that someone ever said, by the way, the Black people are the problem, not the police. And I know that there was a point inside the United States that it was done, but I've not been able to find it. And based upon the way that Dr. Anderson retells and kind of summates every single fact inside of just this prologue, I'm excited to see how she moves forward throughout the story and talks more about where that verbiage came from, where these straw men were first created, and how they've been retouted throughout history to create the dog whistles that they are today. With that being said, dear listener, we have come up to the end of the inaugural episode of Totes Rad, your favorite podcast of banned books that is available on literally any and every platform that you happen to listen to podcasts on. The easiest way to support the podcast is by leaving us a 5-star review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can follow Gemma on Blue Sky or by visiting her website at gemmaanderson.com. Jazz is exclusively on Blue Sky at jazzpomegranate.bluesky.social. And you can find me, DaPurpleSharpie, on Blue Sky or at my website at sharpiepls.com. The official podcast art was designed by Silly Meow Meow on Twitter, and Our jazzy intro/outro music was composed by Gemma Anderson. Did you have an idea for a new book we should cover? Shoot us a message on Blue Sky at totesrad.bluesky.social and use the hashtag TotesRadPodcast. Until next time, dear listener, keep thinking. It'll help you one day.